Hey everyone, welcome back to Hopetales. Today's story will take you from silence to a miracle that still inspires millions. The sun rose gently over Doha International Airport, casting a soft golden glow across the rows of aircraft preparing for departure. Among them stood Flight 408, bound for Istanbul, an Airbus A320 gleaming under the morning light. Passengers moved through the jet bridge with sleepy smiles and quiet excitement. For most, it was just another flight. For some, it was the beginning of something new. Inside the cockpit, the captain, a veteran of 20 years, and his young co-pilot ran through their pre-flight checks. The weather forecast was clear. No storms, no turbulence, just a smooth journey ahead. The aircraft's engines came alive, with a soft rumble that vibrated through the cabin floor. Flight attendants secured the doors, and within moments, Flight 408 was taxiing toward the runway. As the plane lifted off, passengers pressed their faces against the windows, watching the city fade beneath clouds. For an hour, everything was peaceful. Laughter echoed faintly from the back rows. Coffee cups clinked softly on the trays. A little boy played with his toy airplane, telling his mother, "We're flying faster than the clouds." But far above the calm blue sky, nature had other plans. Unnoticed by anyone on the ground, a system of rapidly forming storm cells began to swirl across the black sea region, unexpected, unforecasted, and dangerously unstable. At 10:32 a.m., the first hint of trouble arrived. The radar screen inside the cockpit flashed red. Thick clouds began to form on the horizon, growing fast. The captain contacted air traffic control. "We may encounter some turbulence ahead." Controllers acknowledged and advised. A minor altitude change. But within minutes, the turbulence intensified beyond anything expected. The A320 began to shake softly at first, then violently. Passengers clutched their seats as lightning illuminated the cabin in brief, terrifying flashes. At 10:41 a.m., Flight 408 made its last clear transmission. "We're entering heavy weather." Instruments flickering. "Request immediate," and then static. No voice, no signal. Just a long, broken hiss that faded into silence. Radar contact vanished moments later. The blip that had been Flight 408 disappeared from every screen across control centers. In Turkey and Georgia, controllers exchanged anxious looks. Standard procedure dictated a lost comm protocol, but deep down, every controller knew what it meant when an aircraft vanished over stormy sea with no distress beacon. Within an hour, the news began to spread. A passenger plane has disappeared over the Black Sea. Families gathered at airports, phones shaking in their hands, calling numbers that no longer connected. The world watched as the clock continued to tick, an hour, then 2, then 6. No contact, no debris, no answers. At sunset, search operations began. Coast Guard helicopters, naval ships, and rescue aircraft scanning a vast expanse of dark. Churning water, but the storm made it impossible. Winds howled, visibility dropped to near zero. By nightfall, the search was called off until morning. Meanwhile, in a quiet home in Istanbul, a mother sat by her phone staring at the last message she received from her son, a photo of the airplane window with the caption, "See you soon, Mom." Hours had passed since that message, but she refused to sleep. Every time the phone buzzed, her heart leapt only to fall again into silence. At midnight, officials confirmed what no one wanted to hear. Flight 408 is missing. The next morning, search teams resumed. Helicopters hovered low over the Black Sea, scanning for wreckage. A few floating seat cushions, a torn life jacket, nothing more. The coordinates of the last known signal were marked, but the sea gave back no secrets. Day turned into night again, and the world's attention shifted from confusion to sorrow. Candlelight vigils began outside airports. Newscasters spoke in hushed tones. The words "no survivors" began to echo through headlines. But amid the grief and uncertainty, something strange began to emerge. A faint emergency beacon had been detected, not steady, not clear, but pulsing intermittently, like a heartbeat in the dark. At first, rescuers dismissed it as interference from weather or debris, but as they recalibrated the signals, the pattern became distinct, a coded SOS, faint but alive. The mother who refused to sleep still sat by her phone, unaware of the flicker of hope now forming hundreds of miles away. The sea was still raging. The world still mourned. But somewhere beneath the clouds and the waves, something, or someone, was still fighting to survive. And thus the silence of Flight 408 was not yet the end. It was only the beginning. The morning after Flight 408 disappeared, the Black Sea was gray and merciless. Waves rose like mountains, swallowing anything that dared to float. Rescue ships cut through the waters, their searchlights slicing through fog and rain. Above them, helicopters hovered low, fighting the same storm that had taken the plane. In control rooms across 3 countries, maps were spread open. Circles marked the last known coordinates. Every radar screen glowed with uncertainty. The last signal had ended mid-sentence, a broken call for help that haunted every rescuer's mind. Families filled airport halls, clutching photos, praying, refusing to believe the word missing. Some cried silently. Others stared blankly at screens, waiting for news that wouldn't come. The faces of the passengers' teachers, students, a newlywed couple, a small boy with his toy airplane flashed across the news. The world mourned for lives that seemed lost to the sea. But the rescuers weren't ready to give up. At dawn, a Turkish naval ship picked up a faint reflection on sonar, something metallic, deep below. Divers prepared, but the sea refused to cooperate. The waves were too wild. Visibility was nearly zero. They had to wait. The ocean that day felt alive, as if it wanted to keep its secret buried. Hours turned into a day, then 2. By now, hope was slipping. Reporters spoke in hushed tones about wreckage that might never be found. Officials began drafting statements. The world was ready to move on, but one small signal kept pulling them back. A beacon, weak, intermittent, moving. At first, rescue teams thought it was debris drifting with the currents, a malfunctioning emergency locator from a broken life raft. But the data didn't fit. The signal didn't move randomly. It moved with intention. In short, distinct bursts, almost as if someone was turning it on and off deliberately. They traced it a rough location, nearly 70 kilometers from where Flight 408 had vanished. A new search zone was drawn. Helicopters took off again, scanning every wave, every shimmer of light on the water. By the 3rd day, something appeared on the surface, a seat cushion, a torn section of fuselage, a child's shoe. But there was still no sign of bodies, no rafts, no wreckage large enough to identify. The ocean held its silence. On social media, hope had begun to fade. News anchors started using words like presumed, lost. But in one small control room, a radar operator stared at the moving signal, whispering, "This doesn't look like debris." The pulse was rhythmic, purposeful, almost human. As night fell again, the sky cleared for the first time in 3 days. The storm had finally drifted north. Under the pale moonlight, the sea looked calm, deceptively peaceful, as if mourning what it had taken. The rescue teams resumed their search at full strength. In a coastal village along the Black Sea, a fisherman reported something strange. A glowing light far out on the horizon 2 nights ago. He'd thought it was lightning. But when shown the radar map, his sighting matched the direction of the beacon. That single clue reignited everything. At 3 a.m., a helicopter team launched toward the coordinates. Hours later, as dawn painted the horizon, they reached the area. Nothing but endless water stretching to infinity. Then a flicker. A faint red flare burst through the gray mist, high above the waves, then vanished. The pilots banked sharply, scanning with floodlights. And there it was, a small cluster of debris. And something else, a life raft, torn, half-sunk, tossed by waves. But inside, a figure, a man, motionless, his hand weakly gripping a broken flare gun. When rescuers pulled him aboard, his pulse was barely there. His uniform sleeve read First Officer Flight 408. He was alive. The world changed in that moment. News channels erupted. Co-pilot of Flight 408, found alive. Families who had cried for days now held their breath again. What had happened out there? Where was the rest of the plane? Were there others? The survivor was rushed to a naval hospital. Doctors worked in silence, and within hours he opened his eyes. His first words were barely audible, but one phrase caught everyone's attention. "They're waiting." Search operations shifted immediately toward the coordinates he had drifted from. The beacon signal, once faint, now seemed to grow stronger. Ships moved toward it, their searchlights sweeping the dark sea. On the 4th day after the disappearance, as the morning light returned, A fishing vessel reported something extraordinary. Through binoculars, the crew saw faint smoke on the horizon, and on a small, uncharted island, something written in large letters across the sand. "Photo alive!" The world froze. Could it be true? Within hours, rescue helicopters descended on the island. Cameras recorded every second. What they found there would go down in aviation history. A group of survivors, weak, sunburned, dehydrated, but breathing. 12 souls who had defied the storm and the sea. The co-pilot's words were true. They had been waiting. They had waited through freezing nights, soaked clothes, and endless hunger. They had written that message in the sand using debris from the wreck. And they had never stopped believing that someone, somewhere, would find them. As the rescue crews lifted them into helicopters, the world below erupted in emotion. Tears, prayers, and disbelief filled every screen. Flight 408 had not been a tragedy, it had become a miracle in the making. The silence that once filled the skies had now been broken not by sorrow, but by the sound of survival. And though the storm had swallowed their plane, it could not drown their hope. The true story of what happened up there, and how they managed to live through it all, was yet to come. But for now, the world finally had an answer. Flight 408 was not lost. It had been found, and so had hope. The world watched in disbelief as the first helicopter landed on that nameless island. The camera feed was shaky, the image grainy but clear enough to see them. 12 people, standing weakly in the sand, waving torn life jackets in the air. Sunlight shimmered on their faces, pale and exhausted but alive. The words written beside them, 408 alive, had changed everything. When rescuers rushed toward them, the survivors could barely stand. Their lips were cracked, their hands trembling from dehydration. Some wept, some simply stared into the distance, as if still trapped between nightmare and reality. But when asked how they had survived, their stories would reveal something no one could have imagined. It all began the moment Flight 408 lost power. The lightning strike had come out of nowhere, hitting the aircraft's right engine first, then the left. The cockpit filled with alarms and flashing lights. Within seconds, both engines failed. The plane, once a symbol of control and safety, became a silent glider falling through storm clouds. The captain, a man known for his calm even in chaos, took control manually. He knew what the manuals said. No one had ever survived a ditching in such rough waters. But instead of panic, there was focus. He guided the nose down, searching through sheets of rain for any sign of light, land, or calm sea. As the plane descended, the co-pilot sent the last message, "Request immediate," and the radio went dead. That was the world's final contact. Inside the cabin, passengers prayed, held hands, and cried. The cabin crew shouted instructions through the roar of wind. And in that terrifying descent, something remarkable happened. The captain found a small gap in the storm, a momentary window of stillness. He aimed for it. With the aircraft gliding powerless at just over 180 knots, he managed to level it out just above the sea. The impact came like an explosion. Metal screeched. Waves swallowed the wings. And within seconds, the aircraft broke apart. The rear fuselage sank instantly. But the front half, where the cockpit and front rows were, floated briefly. Amid chaos, emergency slides automatically deployed, transforming into life rafts. The crew worked frantically, helping passengers escape as water rushed in. Screams mixed with the sound of tearing metal. The captain's final act was to ensure that the rafts were released before the cockpit sank beneath the waves. He never made it out. But because of him, 12 people did. Through freezing winds and merciless waves, they clung to 2 damaged life rafts that had drifted apart. For hours, they fought against the current, bailing water out with their bare hands. Lightning illuminated their faces, soaked, shivering and terrified, yet somehow they held on. By dawn, they were lost in open sea. The storm had calmed, but the cold was brutal. They rationed what little they had, a few emergency packs, 1 flashlight, and a beacon with dying batteries. The co-pilot, injured and barely conscious, insisted they keep signaling, switching the beacon on and off to conserve power. That weak signal, the one the world had almost dismissed, was their only voice in the dark. On the second night, waves separated the rafts completely. Half the survivors drifted west, the others east. The co-pilot's group used a piece of fuselage metal to paddle toward what looked like distant clouds but turned out to be land. By the third morning, they reached the small island, little more than a cluster of rocks and trees. There was no food, no shelter, just the endless ocean on every side. They gathered debris from the wreck, plastic covers, pieces of insulation, scraps of fabric. With those, they built makeshift tents. For water, they used an old trick collecting rain in broken bottles. For food, they found seaweed and small fish washed ashore. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stay alive. Every night, they lit small fires using seat cushion foam and wires from the raft battery. The smoke rose weakly into the sky, unseen by anyone. But still, they kept doing it. Hope became their only survival instinct. By the fifth day, exhaustion had set in. The co-pilot was fading, his wounds infected, his strength gone. Yet even then, he told them to keep writing the message in the sand, 408 alive. He said that if they believed the world hadn't forgotten them, then the world wouldn't. And he was right. When the first helicopter appeared on the horizon, it seemed like a dream. The survivors waved desperately, using mirrors and fabric strips to catch the sun. The rescue crew saw it the flash, the movement, the impossible signal of life, and turned toward them. Moments later, the helicopter hovered low, sending waves across the beach. The survivors shielded their faces from the wind, tears streaming down their cheeks. After 4 days of silence, the sky had finally answered back. News of their rescue spread like wildfire. People cried in airports, on trains, in front of their televisions. The same mother who had stared at her son's last photo now clutched it to her heart, whispering through tears of joy. The impossible had happened. Flight 408, the plane that vanished without a trace, had become a story of rebirth, a story of courage, leadership, and faith not in machines but in people. And somewhere in the ocean, beneath miles of cold water, the wreck of Flight 408 lay silent, a tomb of tragedy. Yes, but also a monument to one man's final act of heroism. Because if the captain hadn't guided that aircraft with his last breath, no one would have lived to tell the story. The investigation would later confirm what survivors already knew. The ditching maneuver he performed was almost impossible. The timing, the control, the precision all defied logic. Experts called it a miracle of skill. Survivors called it something simpler. They called it hope. The world moved on. The headlines faded. But for those who survived, every sunrise carried the same message. That sometimes, even in the heart of disaster, humanity finds a way to fly again. The world had almost forgotten about Flight 408. Weeks had passed since its final transmission, engine failure. We're going down. And for most, that was the end of the story. News channels had moved on, social media had grown quiet, and families had begun the painful process of accepting what seemed inevitable. But far away, deep within the Black Sea's isolated islands, life had found a way to hold on. The rescue helicopter circled over the small patch of green surrounded by endless blue. The crew scanned the beach below, expecting nothing more than debris, and then someone shouted. There, drawn across the white sand, were letters big enough to be seen from the sky, 408 alive. At first, disbelief. Then heartbeats quickened. The pilot tilted the helicopter lower, and what they saw next silenced the cabin. Figures, moving, waving. Human life. After 22 days of silence, Flight 408 was not a tragedy, it was a miracle. When the first rescuers touched down, the survivors were barely recognizable. Salt-stained clothes, bruised skin, sunburnt faces. Yet their eyes burned with something fierce and unbreakable. Hope. There were 19 survivors. They had endured crashing seas, hunger, scorching days, freezing nights, and the deafening silence of isolation. The captain, still weak but conscious, had kept a journal on torn scraps of map paper. Inside were details of how they had survived, how they had patched a raft from wreckage, gathered rainwater in makeshift containers, and used flare guns not to call for help, but to keep sharks away during the first nights. Every day, they believed the world had forgotten them, and every night they promised each other, "We will not give up." The story spread across the world like wildfire. Flight 408 survivors found alive. Headlines lit up across every continent. Reporters wept on camera. Families rushed to airports, holding trembling hands and photos they had refused to let go of. In hospitals, survivors were treated for dehydration, fractures, and burns, but every heartbeat reminded doctors of something deeper, the sheer power of the human will to live. Among them was First Officer Ilya Novak, whose name appeared in that final message before the silence. He had been found clinging to a part of the fuselage miles from the island. Rescuers believed he was dead until his fingers moved. Days later, when he regained consciousness, his first words were about the passengers, not himself. He wanted to know if they made it. Investigators soon pieced together what really happened that night. Flight 408 had suffered a dual-engine failure, caused by a massive lightning strike that disabled electrical systems. The pilots had tried to glide toward the coast but lost radar, altitude, and control. Realizing the ocean was their only option, they aimed for a controlled ditching, something almost impossible, to survive at that altitude and speed. But the captain and first officer stayed calm. Instead of fighting the storm, they worked with it, using its wind to slow descent. The impact tore the aircraft apart, but their decision allowed the fuselage to remain intact long enough for dozens to escape. It wasn't luck. It was training, courage, and faith that even when everything falls apart, something greater can still hold you. Weeks later, the survivors gathered at a memorial built near the coast where Flight 408 had first vanished. Families, rescue teams, and ordinary people who had followed their story stood silently as the captain, now walking with a cane, placed a folded piece of paper at the memorial's base. It was his final log entry, the same message he had written in shaky handwriting on that island before rescue came. To anyone who ever feels lost, remember, silence does not mean the end. Somewhere help is already on its way. We survived because we believed not that we would be found, but that we still mattered. That line became the heart of every documentary, every article, every tribute made afterward. Airlines improved emergency beacon systems. Pilots were trained using Flight 408's data as a survival case study. The island was later named Hope Point, a symbol of endurance, reminding future generations that faith and unity can outlive even the deadliest storms. But beyond all that, it was the survivors' bond that left the world in awe. They stayed in touch. They met every year on the anniversary of the rescue, not to mourn what was lost, but to celebrate what was saved. Children born after the crash would listen to their parents tell the story not as a tragedy, but as proof that hope can outfly fear. As the sun set over the memorial that evening, the sound of waves echoed softly, the same waves that once tried to bury their story. And then came the moment that no one saw coming. One of the survivors, now standing by the sea, turned on his old satellite phone, the same one that had recorded that haunting final message. For weeks it had stayed dead, but as the screen flickered to life, one message appeared, sent the moment before the crash, but never delivered due to signal loss. If we don't make it, tell them we tried. Tell them we didn't lose hope. Tears fell freely as silence returned. Except this time it wasn't empty. It was peaceful. The kind of silence that comes after a miracle. Flight 408's story reminds us that even when everything fades into silence, hope still whispers through the storm. This isn't just about a crash. It's about the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. Because sometimes, and the loudest message, is the one that survives.